Stewart no tiene cara de Spanish. Bueno, y la idea, I make a short Spanish, we'll go to. Ustedes saben que hemos estado los últimos 2 días en una reunión de lo que se llama el Council of Council, que es un club, digamos, de think tanks de países miembros del G20, una idea del Council of Foreign Relations, del cual es un importante funcionario Stewart Patrick. Aprovechando esto y su venida a Buenos Aires, nos pareció una muy buena idea que nos contara un poco su libro de recientísima aparición. De todas maneras, se puede conseguir por Amazon. Pero Stewart, con muy buen espíritu, aceptó, a pesar de que hemos tenido 2 o 3 días de intensísima reunión y debe estar más cansado que yo todavía, pero bueno, con buen ánimo se dispuso a presentarnos y por lo que he podido ver del libro tiene un enfoque sumamente interesante y original. Me parece que les va a resultar de gran interés escuchar lo que tiene para decir. La idea es que nos cuente los ejes centrales del libro durante media hora, 40 minutos y después está dispuesto a aceptar preguntas. Habla un inglés bastante aceptable, ¿no? Eso. Okay. Well, thank you, Stewart. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jose Maria. I want to thank Kari, Ambassador Patrick as well, and obviously Alberto for the incredible job that you all did in hosting the Council of Councils, which, as Jose Maria said, is an amazing collection of people from 24 different countries, probably about as many different countries as there are in the G20, because of course there are more than 20 in the G20. But we had wonderful discussions, and I'm very, very honored to be able to present my book to you today. It's a very topical book, unlike many books which when you're writing them and then you finish them feel like hard labor. This was a labor of love, as we say in the United States, and it was a labor of love in part because I think it's so timely, if I do say so myself. The purpose of the book was really to examine why the subject of sovereignty is such a prominent issue and such a controversial issue in the United States, when of course the United States has had a history, at least since 1945, of being one of the most, obviously perhaps the biggest champion of international cooperation and the building of the international institutions after the Second World War and the Great Depression beforehand. So the question is, why is the United States so paranoid often about what it's doing, about international organizations, including about the United Nations and other international institutions. It was motivated, as I said, by my curiosity about the passions which sovereignty arouses. In the United States, you often find that the term sovereignty is evoked as some sort of sacred talisman, as some symbolic issue, but also something that's very vulnerable in the United States. And obviously, sovereignty is very important for many countries around the world. In the book, I do a little bit of comparative analysis and note that, of course, with the members of the G77, the Group of 77, or the non-aligned movement, of course, sovereignty was quite a big theme, particularly for newly liberated colonies or countries that found themselves in the competition between the Soviet Union and the United States in terms of their independence. And of course, other big countries have an interest in sovereignty, but there are some deep well springs or tap roots, I would say, of American ideas about sovereignty. And so I wanted to figure out why a country that is the most powerful that the world has ever seen and also built so many institutions was actually so worried about sovereignty. And so I think of it as what we call a guide to the perplexed, and hopefully hopefully shed some light on things. The reason that sovereignty for Americans tends to mean three big things, and one of them is a right to self-governance, a capacity for independent action and control over the nation's destiny. But the debates over sovereignty are often confused, and in part because these dimensions of sovereignty don't always go together, and I'll explain that a little bit more. They're not the same, and as a result, participants, when they're discussing sovereignty in the United States, often talk past one each other because they don't necessarily mean the same thing when they're talking about sovereignty. What I found, particularly since the end of the Cold War, and particularly during the Trump era, is the topic of sovereignty is easily hijacked in the United States by political opportunists or populist demagogues to short circuit or undercut more sober deliberations and discussions about what sovereignty actually means. And in the United States, if you imply that the sovereignty of America, the United States of America, is under threat, you get people's, we say you get your dander up. You get people get spoiling for a fight, and the best image I can give you is, you may know the cartoon Yosemite Sam. He's the cowboy who gets very angry and has always got 6 shooters, and he's sort of a whirling keg of dynamite, and that's what you get when you start dealing with sovereignty in the United States. And it's very amusing from my position because I run a program at the Council on Foreign Relations on global governance. And for many people, if you're familiar with the Council on Foreign Relations, perhaps this is true in the Kari sense too, is that you are often depicted as being a puppet master, controlling the world. And so we get lumped into, all sorts of conspiracy theories. And I get very colorful email frequently. Sometimes this email is biblical in nature, as in, Dr. Patrick, you remind me of Beelzebub at the Tower of Babel. And global governance didn't work for the devil, and it's not going to work for you either. So these are the sort of emails I get frequently. And one of the reasons that I wanted to write this book was I got an email once that said, it just had 2-word subject line, sovereignty and treason. And it said, you seem like a smart guy, Dr. Patrick, but let me just tell you, if there were a change of regime in the United States, you would be in front of a court for treason to the United States of America. And I thought, where's all this coming from? But I have to say that this preoccupation with sovereignty is not limited only to what we in the United States call the black helicopter crowd. Those are the people who believe that the United Nations has a fleet of black helicopters that at any moment the Secretary General will deploy to different parts of the United States to rob us of our precious liberties. But the idea about sovereignty runs much deeper than that. And each of my chapters I try to begin with some vignettes, for instance, like, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Antonin Scalia, who was one of the associate justices of the US Supreme Court, and he's a constitutional originalist, doesn't believe the Constitution ever changes and that it should all be self-contained. And so in one case, an associate justice, Anthony Kennedy, said we need to strike down the juvenile death penalty. And the reason he gave, in part, was because of evolving standards of human decency and the evolving standards of humanity. He referenced what was going on in Britain and also even in India and in South Africa and a number of other places. And Antonin Scalia said, that's all very interesting, but I thought it was the Constitution of the United States we were talking about. And that in terms of the attitude towards international law, it's a huge thing. And I have other vignettes with George W. Bush, with John Bolton in particular, but even some on the left talking about American sovereignty and how it's sacred and needs to be defended, including by Bernie Sanders in a couple of cases. But the topic of sovereignty is of much more than academic interest because the most prominent contemporary sovereigntist in the United States is, of course, the President of the United States, Donald Trump. When the President goes to the UN General Assembly and mentions the word sovereignty 21 times, it's his 21-gun salute to sovereignty, as I like to refer to it, you get the impression that maybe this is an important thing for the White House, or his speechwriter at least. It's always hard to tell what Donald Trump believes, but certainly his election to the presidency due to the balance between executive and legislative authority. What's it going to do for the ability of the United States to control its borders? And there's some lines in there that are, you know, he's not complaining about potential Mexicans coming into the country, but Senator Lodge is saying, I'm worried that we're going to have a flood of Chinese, Japanese, and Hindu labor. And so all of the echoes of many of the same things are back there. And of course, at the end of the day, the United States did not join the League of Nations. And some of the same attitudes we're seeing now with Donald Trump, and obviously it's most clear in the idea of America first, right? That's an explicit throwback to the interwar years of American isolationism, and the symbol of, or the slogan of people like Charles Lindbergh and others who were trying to keep the United States out of the Second World War and believed that the United States only was going to run into trouble by getting itself entangled. There was also, I think, a certain amount of idealism behind the U.S. reason not to join the League of Nations, and I think that's important to bear in mind. I think for a lot of sovereigntists, it's not simply that the world is a dangerous place. It's also that there's something special about the United States and exceptional about the United States. And Senator Lodge said at the time, he said, I want to keep America as she has been, not isolated, not to prevent her from joining other nations for great purposes, but I wish her to be master of her fate. Let her go on in her beneficent career. I want her to see her stand as she has always stood, strong and alive, triumphant, free. And I think, you know, I think there is an idealism that goes into that one perception of the United States. And I argue that despite the United States' turn to globalism after World War II, these sentiments have endured, and their influence has only risen since the end of the Cold War. And a lot of politicians and intellectuals in the United States now, as well as normal citizens, believe that the U.S. sovereignty is in grave danger thanks to proliferating international organizations, disturbing international legal trends, porous borders with holes in them that jeopardize the rule of law, and also, importantly, dilute Americans' national identity. There are people who believe this. And this attitude is most widely held by conservative nationalists, and it also helps to explain why it's almost impossible in the United States to get a multilateral treaty ratified unless it pertains to something very obscure. These days, it's almost impossible for the United States to ratify a treaty. I think one of the most recent ones was on what we call straddling fish stocks, which are, you know, fish that migrate from, you know, one part of the world to the other. But it's not I mean, it's an important issue if you care about the oceans and biodiversity, but it's not exactly a comprehensive test ban treaty. Let's just put it that way. So with this audience, I mean, there's no need to recapitulate the history of sovereignty and why, you know, since the mid-1700s, at least in Europe, it's been the preeminent way of organizing the world, and so that the entire surface of the globe now, except for Antarctica, is just about is divided up into territorial states as the unit of organization. And I noted that sovereignty is important for many countries, but there are at least 4 factors that make the United States very touchy about sovereignty. One of them is ideology. The United States was the first nation in the world that was founded, the first modern republic, let me put it this way, that was founded on the principle of popular sovereignty, that is the consent of the governed. And the idea here is that sovereignty did not reside in the person of the king, in the dynastic line, or even in some obscure body politic. It actually resided in the people, and the people would have that sovereignty, and they could delegate it, you know, temporarily to elected leaders, but it was like a bank loan that could always recall if they didn't like those leaders. And the fact that the United States was based on that, and that the radicalism of that at the time meant that it contributes to the fact that Americans don't trust their own politicians very much, because they're always worried that they're not. I mean, obviously this is not something that's unique to the United States, but it also, I think, makes Americans more skeptical of international organizations, which are even one further step removed than many other countries. Another issue is American exceptionalism, and you're all obviously very familiar with the notion that the United States is more than despite the hypocrisy in American behavior, that Americans are routinely describing their nation, particularly American officials, as if we were, you know, a shining city on a hill, and that we are, you know, the last best hope of mankind, and all of these things that must make people somewhat ill and nauseous when they hear them abroad. But there has been, since the United States was founding, this notion that the United States has it within its power to make the world over again, which is what the revolutionary Thomas Paine said at the time. And whether the expression of this has been, okay, let's be Wilsonian internationalists and try to remake the world in our own image, or let's be this great model or beacon for humanity, the one commonality in it is that the United States has much to teach the rest of the world, but fundamentally has very little to learn from the rest of the world. And I think that goes into explaining why the United States often takes a sovereigntist position. Another aspect that makes the United States so sovereigntist really is the separation of powers under the U.S. constitutional system. Even we've seen this repeatedly, that even when an executive branch or a U.S. president wants to join a particular treaty, it's very, very difficult to do so because of the 2/3 hurdle for Senate ratification of treaties in the United States. In addition, under the Constitution, the 50 U.S. states retain quite a bit of power to be able to, if not block treaties, at least have jurisdiction over certain matters that are increasingly contained in many international treaties. And then finally, there's the role of geopolitics. Obviously, since 1776, the United States has gone from being a small country of 2.5 million people scattered along the eastern seaboard of the Atlantic to being a country of 330, 340 million people and the most powerful country the world's ever known. But the impact on U.S. sovereignty has been ambiguous. On the one hand, it's given the U.S. More confidence, perhaps, but on the other hand, it's also given it more bilateral and unilateral options than many other countries have. And also there tends to be a view in the United States that, well, as the ultimate custodian of world order, no matter what the UN Charter says, that there are many custodians, right, or several custodians, that as the ultimate custodian of world order, the United States needs to be free to act, and so it has to defend its sovereignty in that regard. The argument that I make is that increasingly all four of these underlying sources of American sovereigntism are colliding with realities of globalization, and that the accelerating volume and accelerating velocity and swelling volume of international transactions, as well as expanding cross-border threats and also externalities, like climate change, for instance. But these problems like proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, financial instability, pandemic, disease, all these things require even the most powerful country in the world to actually curtail its sovereign autonomy, although only rarely its sovereign authority, to exert sovereign influence over its destiny. So I look at how this plays out in 5 different spheres of international activity. One of them is international law. Another is international arms security and arms control, trade and the world economy, border security and immigration, and then international organizations, particularly the United Nations. So the chapter on international law is called Do As I Say, Not As I Do. And it tries to capture this Janus-based attitude the United States has towards international law, whereas the U.S. is both, on the one hand, the leading proponent of a rule-bound international system, and also one of its leading opponents, or major obstacle, I should say. And it begins with a couple of vignettes. One of them, as I mentioned, was Justice Scalia getting very, very angry that Anthony Kennedy has cited foreign law and foreign findings to strike down a law against the juvenile death penalty. And the second, though, is where there's a bunch of Republican senators who are getting really mad, like Rick Santorum of Pennsylvania, or Orrin Hatch of Utah. They're getting very mad because they do not want the United States to ratify the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Because, as Senator Hatch said, ratifying this treaty would change virtually all aspects of American life, which is crazy. But there's this notion that if we ratify this treaty, a committee of 12 observer people in Vienna, in Geneva, who will monitor compliance with this treaty will be able to say, well, we don't think you're doing as good a job, and so therefore there's this fear that somehow that's actually going to compel any change on the part of the United States, and it's just totally absurd. And yet, even though the this treaty was based on something called the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the United States had drafted the treaty, basically, to conform to the United States and put in all these qualifications to make sure that it couldn't change any U.S. state law or anything. It basically was a way of internationalizing what U.S. does domestically. We still didn't, they still didn't get enough votes to do it because there were a whole lot of different reasons, but it's crazy. And sovereignty concerns about international law have a lot of different, there are several perceived problems. One of them is there's this proliferation of multilateral treaties that increasingly deal with behind the border things that are intrusive to the United States. There's also a big feeling among sovereigntists, I would argue, for as if they, in a sense, are forcing things on the country itself. And the argument that I make is that in the United States and in many other countries, the turn to hyperglobalization in the 1980s and 1980s really freed capital, but it undercut a lot of the social bargains that had been at the heart of the post-war trading system. And you know, it's clear, and this was actually a topic of conversation at the meeting that we had over the last couple of days. It's clear that there need to be some renegotiation of rules. That doesn't mean going against liberalism in general or going against open trade in general, but there need to be certain rules that sort of restore some of the balance between balance between beneficiaries within, because you need to have a social compact in a sense to be able to sustain an open trading system. So that's part of the argument that I make. I also suggest that arguments that the World Trade Organization is somehow an infringement on American sovereignty, which are arguments that you hear quite a bit, including from the Trump administration, are largely overblown. But the Trump administration, and this is very important, I think, for countries like Argentina, which want, or at least certainly under this government, want the United States to, and other countries to embrace an open trading system that's rule-bound, is that you actually have had a number of indications from the Trump administration that they are willing to overturn or at least ignore the findings of the appellate body of the World Trade Organization. And if they find themselves to be not in compliance, they'll simply ignore the findings of the WTO. That is an extremely dangerous position to take, because it's one thing to say, okay, we're not happy with it, we'll abide by it, and we'll let other countries, you know, respond in kind or, you know, take countervailing measures. But it's another, it's an entirely different system to basically say we don't really care what the rules are. We're going to just go in a bilateral tit-for-tat way. I'm almost done here. I realize I've been going around a bit, but I wanted to give you a sense of what the book is about. There's, in the interest of time, I won't go into great detail about the next chapter, which is about border security. And that one starts with the vignette of Trump's wall, which was really interesting because, you know, when he went, I think it was in June, probably in June of 2015, when he declared his candidacy, he, you know, everybody was expecting that forever, but what really made news that day was that when he talked about, you know, building his wall and making Mexico pay for it. And it was really interesting that at a visceral level, I think, people say, well, that sounds like a really stupid idea. But at a visceral level, I think, for many Americans and for many people anywhere, if a country can't control its borders, then is it sort of truly sovereign? And I think a lot of Americans had gotten tired of repeatedly presidents saying, we're going to get control of the Southern American border, et cetera, and we're going to do this. And in fact, they didn't really do that much about it for a long time, although they had begun to under the Obama administration. But the problem with the way the president was presenting it was, first of all, that the wall is a ridiculous idea, and that it totally ignores the economic incentives at play here, and the fact that as long as Americans, corporations, businesses, agriculturalists rely, and people who, apparently in my neighborhood, who hire large numbers of folks of questionable residency permits to do their lawns, as long as those economic incentives exist, we have to be honest with ourselves. That labor is going to continue to come in, and so there has to be some sort of guest labor, guest worker permit, et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of different things, but the other thing that came out of this was, and that Trump, there was ugly nativism and nationalism that came out with, obviously with Trump's border wall. And it appealed in coded language often to some racist or ethnocentric overtones. And there There are some historical reasons for that I'd be happy to go into in terms of how there have been waves of panic over immigration in the United States that are not particularly appetizing. But the argument that I make is that the border issue testifies to, in the United States, sort of an uglier, often uglier, but a societal dimension to what it means to be sovereign. Because the whole notion of popular sovereignty presupposes the notion of a people that are sovereign, but who are the people? And in theory, in US political discourse and constitutional discourse, the people are individuals who agree to the principles of the Constitution of the United States. In reality, sometimes the people are people who look like you and me and speak our language. And so there's obviously a big tension there, to be honest. The final really thematic chapter that I talk about is it turns to the U.S. attitudes towards international organizations, and it's called "Don't Tread on Me" is the title. And I actually begin this one with a vignette of Brexit, which may seem a bit odd, but Boris Johnson, you know, the British foreign minister, is just dismissing, he's withering in his criticism of Barack Obama, who tried to insert himself into the Brexit debate. He said, it is the height of hypocrisy, exorbitant hypocrisy, for the president to insert himself in this debate and tell us to sacrifice, to stay within the European Union when we have already sacrificed so much more sovereignty than Americans would ever consider by joining the European Union. And the argument that I make in the chapter is that despite all these conservative critiques that the United States has given of sovereignty, in fact, we haven't. And I make the argument that Boris Johnson may have been wrong about the wisdom of Brexit, but he was not wrong when he said that the Brits had given up much more sovereignty than Americans would ever consider, because the EU does require some subordination to obviously to Brussels and to European-wide institutions, whereas the United States, in joining these international organizations, has joined up to international organizations that are horizontal in nature, not supranational in nature. I do say that there are problems in terms of democratic accountability within the United Nations and others, but that basically these can be handled creatively by the United States. So my overall, again, the overall ultimate conclusion is that there's both less and more at stake in the sovereignty debate that is often asserted. Contrary to the arguments of sovereigntists, the United States faces few threats to its sovereign authority in terms of the Constitution of the United States, or the Supreme, and there's no threat to popular sovereignty in the United States. But what the U.S. does face increasingly is a trade-off between sovereignty as autonomy and sovereignty as influence. In other words, as global power diffuses, economic integration deepens, and cross-border challenges proliferate, the imperative for multilateral cooperation is only getting more and more important. And I think Americans, so if you ask what the audience of this book is to, it's largely for, I mean, I think it will help people in other countries and hopefully here and elsewhere understand some of the dynamics, but it's basically trying to convince Americans, including American citizens, that they shouldn't fight against the world that America made. If anything, they have to redouble their commitment to multilateral cooperation, and that trying to build a fortress America or an America first is a fool's errand. I do also say that that there are ways to mitigate even some of the concerns about lost freedom of action, and we see this in new forms of multilateralism and multilateral cooperation that are increasing. It's not just formal institutions anymore, like the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank or the United Nations. It's also informal coalitions of the willing, if you will, that can complement those. The G20 being a decent example of one of those. So this is the topic of with this bit of an outline of the book, and I'd love to answer any questions. I realize that I spoke for some time, but Jose Maria suggested that I give you a sense of what the book is really about. Thank you.
In fact, you did very well your job. You know, we have a presentation, book presentation, quite often here, but not very often we have such a detailed presentation. I would say that it goes against your interest because
that's right, exactly.
I don't know It is necessary to read the book.
Exactly. There's so much more in the book, actually. I didn't give you the juice.
Thank you very much, Dr. Patrick, for this very attractive presentation.
Thank you very much.
I will come back just on the request eventually of a brief comment rather than a question. You touched upon a historical line in the States of this relation between sovereignty and internationalism, or isolationism and internationalism, the way you want it. But as far as I recall in American history, when you had proposals, the debates came before, and if the United States didn't have a feeling about it, then you didn't go forward. That was the case of Wilson, as you mentioned, with the League of Nations. That was the case of Truman with the Havana Charter. So those projects were abandoned. But I don't recall the case, as you suggested yourself, of the US government trying to kill institutions which he promoted in hard strength. And I'm thinking about what you mentioned about the WTO, in which
Yes.
Well, I think that is one of the reasons why I'm a skeptic. And there are many threats to sovereignty, but I would choose two of them to ask you about. One is certainly the official one, or the government's one, which is Russia and China and their development. But the other one comes from the private sector, the multinationals. And I think that the multinationals, coupled with advancements of science and technology, is where you perhaps are facing the greatest weakening possibilities or probabilities, because dealing with governments is much easier, I think, for you than it would be dealing with private enterprises and research and development taking place in other countries and in other firms, for instance. But otherwise, I think that it's an excellent contribution, and I look forward to have a chance to read it in detail.
Thank you very much. And I do, for those of you who thought I talked about everything, I do try to, I talk a bit about the question of whether or not sovereignty is at bay, generally speaking, and about the value and dilemmas that sovereignty poses. And a part of that is about, is there a changing relationship between the sovereign state vis-a-vis private corporations, given the immense power that they can bring to bear and their technological virtuosity. And so, and the move, many people have said, towards a sort of a more a complex global governance in which there are multiple actors that have power that we haven't seen before. And there are arguments on both sides of that in terms of whether or not we've seen this before. You think of Dutch East India Company or British East India Company and things like that, or the power of the Roman Catholic Church, etc. But in terms of non-state actors that have extraordinary power, but it is a fascinating topic. And I think also with the advances of technology, you increasingly have to have multi-stakeholder models of governance, and we've seen this in the internet is probably the classic case, but increasingly outer space where you have the private sector exploding with Elon Musk and Blue, what's called the other one, but there are many actors now in that space that haven't been there before.
Regarding sovereignty, as understood by the Trump administration, in essence, I think, as you have explained, it covers a rather nationalistic and isolationistic policy. The implication being that the United States is really not, or much less interested in world affairs than what it used to be. As a result, you have the possibility of fostering perhaps a more violent or chaotic world, because ultimately nobody is in charge. Since the Second World War, we had the Pax Americana, which one way or another was being followed by practically every administration. This administration is apparently not so interested anymore in the Pax Americana and is saying, we just care basically for ourselves unless something very important is happening around the world. What will happen is perhaps that the world will be fragmented into spheres of influence. You will have on the one hand the Russian, the Chinese, the European, and the American. This is exactly contrary to what we have been building up so far. And it is extremely dangerous because one day or another, it's very likely that you will have an open war between one of the blocs. So, in essence, this policy which is being followed is very short-sighted. It goes against developing common values amongst nations. And something else, it is totally lacking in moral values. This administration is following a sovereign foreign policy, which is perhaps realistic from a realism point of view, but it is contrary to the sentiment of a large sector of the American population of society. So most foreign policies which were lacking in the moral dimension have shown to be failures. So that's another reason for why I am rather skeptical about this particular form of sovereignty carried out by the administration.
Yeah, I that's extraordinarily eloquent, and I couldn't agree more. I actually sort of think of it as sort of the international projection of Donald Trump's narcissism onto U.S. foreign policy.